Hello everybody, I'm Carl. Thank you for coming by. Today's story is The Night Harbor. It's a modern day fantasy about Dave Mitchell, a folklore professor grappling with writer's block in the middle of a career crisis. To get a change of pace and environment, he's taking a sabbatical in Hamburg, Germany, and one day, hoping for inspiration, he finds himself in the pre-dawn hours at the Hamburg fish market, where merchants have been trading goods since 1703. David comes across a mysterious coffee vendor who brews more than coffee and opens David's eyes to a whole new world. The Night Harbor is a tale of magical realism that explores the differences between analyzing stories and truly experiencing them. It's set against the atmospheric backdrop of Hamburg's waterfront and weaves together the themes of academic burnout, family legacy, and the magic that lives in the spaces between tellings. Please hit the like button if you enjoyed the story. If you want to see more, hit subscribe. And above all, I am still relatively new to writing, and I would appreciate any comments, good or bad. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the story.
Dave Mitchell stared at the blinking cursor on his laptop screen, watching it pulse like a mechanical heartbeat against the white emptiness of the document. Outside his small St. Pauli flat, Hamburg's December darkness pressed against the windows. His phone's screen told him it was already 4 a.m. The cursor blinked again, mocking him with its steady rhythm. 67 days in Germany, and he hadn't written a single worthwhile word. His coffee had gone cold again, third cup since midnight, and still no words. Back in Boston, he taught his students about writer's block with compassion. It's not about being stuck, he'd say. It's about finding your way back to the story. Those words held a different weight now, sitting alone in Hamburg, trying to find his own way back. The document's header still read, "Modern applications of traditional narrative structures in." The rest remained blank, like everything else he'd tried to write since the incident. His department chair's words echoed in his head, a complete breakdown of academic professionalism, concerns about mental fitness. Taking a leave of absence might be best. Dave closed the laptop harder than necessary. On his bookshelf, well-worn copies of folklore, collections, and mythological studies stood in silent judgment. Books he'd once loved, stories he'd once brought to life for eager undergraduates. Now they were just reminders of another life, another David James Mitchell who hadn't lost his way. His phone buzzed. Another email from the department secretary about paperwork for his sabbatical. He ignored it, like he'd ignored the last 6. Let them think he was finding himself in Europe, having some eat, pray, love moment of spiritual awakening. Better than admitting he was hiding in a 6th-floor walk-up, watching his savings dwindle while he failed to write. The flat was small even by European standards, a converted attic space with slanting ceilings and windows that looked out over Hamburg's sprawling port. He'd chosen it precisely for that view, though he couldn't have explained why. Something about the constant movement of ships, the ebb and flow of commerce and humanity spoke to him in ways he couldn't articulate. His grandmother's inheritance had made this escape possible, just enough for a year abroad if he was careful. "Find your stories again," she'd written in her last letter, as if she'd known he would need an escape hatch. She'd been the one to tell him about Hamburg in the first place, her stories of the port city sparking his first interest in how tales traveled across oceans and cultures. Dave pulled on his heavy coat and grabbed his notebook, empty like all the others he'd bought since arriving. The stairs creaked under his feet as he descended, each step an accusation. Failure, failure, failure. Outside, the city was caught in that strange hour between night and dawn. The last drunk revelers still stumbled from the Reeperbahn's endless bars, while early shift workers hurried past with coffee cups clutched like talismans against the cold. The air smelled of salt water and possibilities, though That last part might have been his writer's imagination, or what was left of it. He walked without destination, letting muscle memory guide him through streets that had become familiar over the past 2 months. His German was still terrible, but he'd learned enough to navigate the basics. Ein Kaffee bitte and Entschuldigung, covering most of his daily interactions. The harbor drew him like a magnet, as it did most mornings. Something about the water helped, even if it didn't unlock whatever had frozen inside him. The massive cranes stood like sleeping giants against the pre-dawn sky, their lights blinking red in steady rhythm. A different kind of cursor, marking time in the darkness. His phone buzzed again. Mom this time probably checking if he'd found himself yet. Her voice message yesterday had been a masterpiece of passive-aggressive concern. We just worry, David. Jordan Harrison's daughter is doing so well at Yale Law. He let it go to voicemail. The incident played through his mind again, unbidden. One moment he'd been lecturing on comparative mythology, drawing parallels between ancient hero quests and modern narratives. The next, well, the video had gone viral in certain academic circles. The rising star of folklore studies having a complete breakdown mid-lecture, ranting about the death of authentic storytelling in the digital age. He'd used words like cultural strip mining and commodification of wonder. The students had looked terrified. He'd walked out mid-lecture, leaving his notes scattered across the podium. By sunset, the faculty message boards were buzzing. By midnight, the video had made its way to academic Twitter. By morning, the department chair was waiting in his office with that carefully neutral expression. Administrators perfect over years of handling faculty crises. The harbor carried the sharp bite of the deck member air. Tourist season had ended months ago, leaving the waterfront to those who actually worked here: sailors, dock workers, fish merchants, and the occasional insomniac professor pretending to be a writer. The massive Christmas market in the city center drew most visitors away from the water, leaving these early morning hours to the real Hamburg. He checked his phone. 4:47 a.m. The fish market would be officially starting at 5. The famous Hamburg Fish Markt had run every Sunday since 1703, though nowadays it was as much tourist attraction as actual market. But at this hour, before the tour buses arrived, it still held echoes of its original purpose. Real traders still came here, conducting business the way their great-grandparents had. The market hall itself, the Fischauktionshalle, loomed ahead, a red brick cathedral to commerce built in 1894. During summer weekends, it transformed into an early morning dance hall after the clubs closed, but this December it stood quiet, waiting for the day's business to begin. Dave remembered reading that Hamburg's position on the Elbe River had made it a crucial point for story transmission across Europe. Tales traveled with trade, shifting and changing, like cargo being transferred from ship to ship. His grandmother used to tell him that every story in Europe had passed through Hamburg's harbor at some point, picking up local color before moving on. Stories are like cats, she'd say, in that precise Boston accent that seemed to sharpen with age. They go where they please, but they always know where the fish are. He hadn't understood what she meant then. He still didn't. The first vendors were setting up their stalls, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this thousands of times before. The air filled with German, Turkish, Polish, a dozen languages, competing with the sound of crates being unstacked and tables being arranged. Dave found himself a spot against one of the market hall's outer walls, just watching. He'd started bringing his notebook to these early morning wanderings, though he never wrote anything. Sometimes he'd open it, pen poised, waiting for inspiration that never came. The blank pages seemed to multiply every time he looked away. His academic work had once focused on how stories adapted to new contexts, how they survived by changing. Narratives are living things, he'd written in his first published paper, evolving to survive in new cultural ecosystems. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years studying how stories changed and survived, only to find himself unable to tell any stories at all. The market was coming alive around him now. Fishmongers arranged their displays with artistic precision, each fish placed just so, ice carefully distributed to catch the light. The first coffee vendors were firing up their machines, sending steam into the cold air. Somewhere, someone was testing a microphone, the feedback echoing off the old brick walls. That's when he noticed the other cart, the one that hadn't been there a moment ago. Or had it? His memory felt suddenly uncertain, like trying to recall a dream while still half asleep. The cart stood in a pool of warm light that seemed to push back against the pre-dawn darkness, and music, Bob Marley, he thought, drifted from an ancient boombox, perched precariously on one corner. The cart's owner moved with the music, his dreads swaying as he arranged cups and adjusted dials on what looked like a cross between an espresso machine and something from a Victorian science museum. Copper pipes twisted counterintuitive around glass chambers, and steam escaped in rhythmic puffs that somehow matched the music's beat. Ah, another sleepless wanderer. The man's voice carried a thick Jamaican accent and more genuine warmth than Dave had heard in months. Come, come, the morning is too cold for standing in shadows. Dave found himself moving forward before he'd made a conscious decision to do so. The cart itself was a converted roll-top desk, its surface covered in years of collected decorations. Ribbons, beads, concert pins, and patches from what looked like sailors' uniforms. Everything about it should have seemed cluttered or chaotic. But somehow it all worked together, like a story told in objects rather than words. Marcus knows just what you need, the vendor said, already working at his strange machine. No, not the regular blend. Your eyes say something special is required. He looked up, fixing Dave with a gaze that seemed to see straight through his carefully maintained facade of being fine. Professor, yes, but not teaching now, running from stories that won't come. Dave stepped back, startled. How did you... The shoulders, they always carry the weight of unwritten books. Marcus laughed, the sound somehow harmonizing with the music. And these days, you carry many unwritten books, Professor Mitchell. I didn't tell you my name. Didn't you? Marcus winked, his hands never stopping their dance over the coffee machine's controls. Memory plays tricks in the early morning. Like stories, it comes and goes as it pleases. The smell coming from the machine was unlike any coffee Dave had encountered. Notes of cardamom and star anise, something deeper that reminded him of old books and sea air. And underneath it all, something he couldn't quite identify, but that made him think of his grandmother's study, where she told him stories of Hamburg's harbor. This is my special blend, Marcus said, pouring the dark liquid into a cup that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the cart's warm light. Best drunk in the shadows, where the old walls keep their secrets. Some say it helps lost things find their way home. Dave took the cup, noticing how the steam rose in perfect spirals. How much do I... Stories are the only currency I need, Marcus interrupted, already turning to adjust his ancient boombox. And you, Professor Mitchell, are full of untold ones. Drink, the market is waiting.